What happens when one of the biggest voices in rock music suddenly realizes that he no longer knows who he is? By the end of the 1990s, David Coverdale had already lived several musical lives. He had been the voice of Deep Purple, the leader of Whitesnake, a global rock star, and half of the Coverdale Page project with Jimmy Page. But after Whitesnake came to an end in 1997, Coverdale found himself at a very different point in his career. The stadiums, the big guitars, the enormous productions, and the Whitesnake image had become so closely associated with him that he began to question where David Coverdale ended and where the Whitesnake persona began. That question would lead to his third solo album, Into the Light, released in 2000. And unlike the huge hard rock records that had made his name, this was going to be something much more personal. Following the end of Whitesnake, Coverdale wanted to step away from the expectations that came with the band. He had spent years creating music that had to fit the Whitesnake identity, but now, without the band, he had the opportunity to make music simply because he wanted to make it. Coverdale described the concept behind Into the Light as coming out of what he considered a dark period in his life. He had reached a point where he questioned the identity he had created around himself. In other words, he wasn't trying to make another 1987. He wasn't trying to compete with the MTV era. And he wasn't trying to prove that he could still make arena rock. He wanted to rediscover himself. Musically, that meant moving away from the bombast of Whitesnake and returning to some of the ingredients that had always been important to him: blues, soul, R&B, and classic rock. The album was therefore almost a reset, and even the title, Into the Light, suggested the idea of emerging from a difficult period and moving towards something more positive. This was David Coverdale without the enormous Whitesnake machine around him. And to create that music, he needed the right musicians. Coverdale didn't simply assemble another conventional rock band and start rehearsing. Instead, he brought together a collection of experienced musicians and created an environment where the songs could develop naturally. One of the key parts of the process was renting a house near his home and bringing musicians together for an intensive period of writing and rehearsal. The idea was to jam, experiment, and see what happened. According to the material surrounding the project, musicians generated more than 20 songs during this period. One of the most important musicians involved was drummer Denny Carmassi, who had already worked with Coverdale and Whitesnake. But Coverdale also wanted a different kind of guitar sound. That brought in Earl Slick, the legendary guitarist known for his work with David Bowie and John Lennon. Instead of simply reproducing the metallic guitar attack of the 1980s Whitesnake, Slick brought a more bluesy, expressive, and classic rock approach. Doug Bossi became another important collaborator, contributing guitar and working as an associate producer. On bass was Marco Mendoza, while keyboards came from Mike Finnigan, a musician whose resume included work with Jimi Hendrix. And that combination was important. This wasn't a band assembled to recreate the Whitesnake formula. It was a collection of musicians chosen because they could serve the songs Coverdale wanted to make. And that difference can be heard throughout the album. If someone came into the light expecting another Whitesnake album, they were probably going to be surprised. The album contains several different musical styles, but they all connect back to Coverdale's roots. The foundation is blues rock. A song like River Song is expansive and atmospheric, with a much more organic feeling than the polished arena rock of Whitesnake. Then there is soul and R&B. Love is Blind is one of the clearest examples. Rather than building around a huge guitar riff, the song allows Coverdale's voice to carry the emotion. And that's another important part of the record. Coverdale doesn't spend the entire album trying to hit the high notes that became a trademark of his Whitesnake years. His voice is warmer, more relaxed, and more soulful. There are also elements of psychedelic and experimental rock, particularly in some of the album's longer and more atmospheric arrangements. You can hear echoes of the 1970s throughout the record, including some of blues and progressive influences that have always been part of Coverdale's musical background. Then there are the acoustic moments. Wherever You May Go is particularly different from the traditional Whitesnake power ballad.
My life is over when my time is through.
He uses acoustic guitar, Spanish influences, harp, and laid vocals to create something much more intimate. And the album doesn't completely abandon hard rock. Songs such as Slave still have a driving rhythm and enough attitude to remind us that this is David Coverdale. But the difference is that the hard rock elements are now part of a musical palette rather than the entire identity of the album. Into the Light wasn't Coverdale trying to escape his past, it was Coverdale deciding which parts of his past he actually wanted to keep. Commercially, Into the Light was never going to compete with the Whitesnake albums that had sold millions of copies, and it didn't. The album was released in September 2000 through EMI in the UK, while the American release came later through Coverdale's Dragon's Head imprint. In the UK, Into the Light reached number 75 on the main albums chart. But there was a much better story on the UK Rock and Metal Albums chart, where it reached number 5 and remained on the chart for 4 weeks. In Japan, the album performed even better, reaching number 25 on the Oricon Albums chart. So this wasn't a commercial disaster, but it certainly wasn't a comeback on the scale of 1987. The album also divided some listeners. Fans who wanted classic Whitesnake sound could find the record too subdued. But for listeners willing to accept what Coverdale was attempting, Into the Light demonstrated something important. He didn't need to make another stadium rock album to prove that he was still an artist. In many ways, this was one of the most personal records he had ever made. Unfortunately, the commercial results weren't enough to keep Coverdale's solo career moving forward with EMI, and the planned solo touring never developed into the campaign originally envisioned. And eventually Coverdale would find himself heading back towards a band that had made him famous. For more than 2 decades, Into the Light remains something of an overlooked chapter in Coverdale's career. Then, in 2024, that changed dramatically. Rhino released Into the Light, the solo albums, a 6 CD collection covering Coverdale's 3 solo albums, Whitesnake from 1977, North Winds from 1978, and Into the Light from 2000. And this wasn't simply a reissue. The albums were revisited with new remixes, remasters, additional recordings, demos, and previously unreleased material. More importantly, Coverdale now considers these records part of the Whitesnake legacy. He has essentially changed the way the albums are viewed. What were once 3 David Coverdale solo albums can now be seen as part of a larger story of the man behind Whitesnake, and Into the Light received a particularly interesting treatment. The 2024 remix expanded the original album with additional material, including All the Time in the World and Let's Talk It Over, along with alternate versions, demos, and unfinished songs. The collection also gave the album a much bigger physical presentation, including a 6 CD box set with a 60-page book and a separate double LP edition of the new Into the Light remix. For an album that had been somewhat forgotten, this was a second chance, and it gave longtime Whitesnake fans a reason to go back and rediscover the record. And this brings us to an important question. Were Coverdale's original solo albums from the 1970s simply remastered? No, the 2024 collection actually gives us both approaches. The original albums were remixed using modern technology, while the original mixes were also remastered. So fans can hear the new interpretations while still having access to the original mixes in remastered form. The 1977 album Whitesnake and 1978 North Winds received particularly extensive treatment. The new technology allowed the production team to separate elements of the original recording and create new mixes. Coverdale even used technology to revisit arrangements that he had wanted to explore for decades. That makes the 2024 box set more than a simple nostalgia project. It is Coverdale looking backward his entire solo career and essentially saying, I finally have the technology to finish some of the recordings the way I always wanted. And suddenly, Into the Light was no longer an isolated album from 2000. It had become part of a much larger story.
My life is over when my time is through.
So what did David Coverdale do after Into the Light? He went back to Whitesnake. In 2003, Coverdale reformed the band for our 25th anniversary world tour. The new lineup included Doug Aldrich, Reb Beach, Timothy Drury, Tommy Aldridge, and importantly, Marco Mendoza. Mendoza's involvement was one of the lasting connections between Into the Light and the next chapter of Coverdale's career. The reunion wasn't simply a one-off nostalgia event. Whitesnake continued touring throughout the following years, sharing stages with major rock acts and rebuilding its identity for a new generation. In 2006, the band released the DVD Live in the Still of the Night, capturing the reunited Whitesnake lineup in concert. The same year, Live in the Shadow of the Blues followed, and that album contained something even more important: new Whitesnake studio material. It was the first indication that Coverdale wasn't simply interested in touring the old hits. He was preparing to make a new Whitesnake studio album. By 2007, Coverdale was working closely with guitarist Doug Aldrich. The two became the prominent songwriting partnership behind the next phase of Whitesnake. They began recording new material in Los Angeles and Lake Tahoe. And some of the ideas that had been sitting in Coverdale's archives for years finally found a home. In fact, the 2024 solo collection reveals that one of the old Into the Light era demos, Lay Your Love on Me, would eventually evolve into Lay Down Your Love on the next Whitesnake studio album. The album would finally arrive in 2008. Its title was Good to Be Bad. Into the Light is an unusual chapter in David Coverdale's story. It came after the end of Whitesnake, at a time when Coverdale wasn't sure whether he wanted to continue living inside the character of David Coverdale that the public had created. Instead of making another giant hard rock record, he stripped things back. He brought in musicians from different backgrounds to explore blues, soul, R&B, acoustic music, and classic rock. Commercially, it didn't become another 1987, but artistically, it gave Coverdale something much more important. It gave him a way forward, and eventually, that path led him right back to Whitesnake. So I'm going to be talking about the Whitesnake album from 2008, but before I do that, I still have two more Deep Purple albums to cover. The Deep Purple album, Bananas, with that weird album cover, and the one after that, Rapture of the Deep. Then after that, I'll talk about the next Whitesnake album. So, thanks for watching. Check out the playlist. It should be on the screen right now. It has over 50 videos telling the entire story of the Deep Purple family tree. And I still have more to go. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one.